Okay.
Welcome everyone in attendance at this remote meeting of the local review body of Aberdeen City Council. Please note that the meeting will be recorded and published online for public access after the meeting. Could I ask that all attendees switch off their camera and their microphone when not speaking? The camera and microphone should only be switched on when you're invited to speak, and guidance on how to do this is contained in the guidance issued to yourselves. I'll now ask the clerk to advise members participating today for all the members to confirm their attendance once their name has been announced by the clerk, and so that this is clear in the recording of the meeting. As the local review bodies contains judicial business, members are reminded that they should not leave the room / meeting during consideration of any of the applications. Can I ask the clerk to advise the members, please?
Okay, thank you, convener. Can I just check everybody's here? So, Councillor MacDonald?
I'm here.
Councillor Mackenzie?
Here.
Councillor Duncan?
Here.
Okay, thank you. We can move on.
So this meeting is being convened in response to 3 requests for a review of the decision taken by the appointed officer under the council scheme of delegation. Members of the local review body have before them copies of the review documents as listed in the notice calling the meeting, and I, Councillor Sandra MacDonald, will be the chairperson for this one hearing, and the 2 hearings afterwards will be chaired by Councillor Bolton. I'll now ask Mrs. McBain, the Assistant Clerk, to outline the procedure to be followed in the conduct of these reviews.
Thank you, convener. Members have the procedure note which was circulated with the meeting papers and is intended to set out the wider framework within which the review process operates. From this, it is clear that the first task for the review body is to come to a decision on whether the review documents contain sufficient information for the case to be determined without further procedure, and by that it is meant without further information or representation. To assist, I feel it would be helpful to mention the following. Firstly, that the regulations governing the local review process require that all matters which the applicant intends to raise in the review must be set out in or accompany the notice of review. Secondly, that the focus of the review should be on the basis of what was before the appointed officer when a decision was made, and only in exceptional circumstances will new or additional matters be permitted to be taken into account. Thirdly, to note that the modernisation of the planning system, which included revisal of the planning appeals process, of which this local review body is part, removed the previous right on the part of an applicant to insist on a hearing and replaced that with the local review body, providing them with the power to choose a procedure which more accurately reflects the facts and circumstances of the individual case. And lastly, that guidance issued by the Scottish Government's Chief Planner in 2011 stated that reviews by local review bodies should be conducted by means of full consideration of the application afresh. This review should take the form of a structured discussion led by the chairperson to consider the matter set out in the notice of review before you, and I would conclude by drawing your attention in particular to points 10 to 12 of the procedure note. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mrs. McBain. So could we turn to consider the first review in respect of the decision to refuse the application for the erection of a dwelling house with a double garage and associated access road at Highview House, Blacktop Road, Aberdeen, number 191418. We will now hear the planning advisor in attendance, Mr. Gavin Evans, who will provide us with a brief description of the application proposal and a reminder of the reasons why the application was refused. I would point out that Mr. Evans attends today's meeting to provide us with the necessary professional planning guidance because he was not involved in the earlier consideration of the application under review. Mr. Evans will not, however, be asked to express any view on the merits of the proposed development, and in effect, his role will be a neutral one involving the provision of factual information and guidance only. Thank you, Mr. Evans.
Thank you, convener. I'll just take a moment here to get the agenda pack and the presentation up on screen for everyone.
Yes, I can see that. Thank you.
I can see that. Great. Okay, so as you mentioned, convener, before us we have a request for review against an application refused under delegated powers for detailed planning permission for the erection of a dwelling house with double garage and associated access road at Highview House, Blacktop Road, Aberdeen. The review was found to have been submitted with all the necessary information and within the time limit of 3 months following the decision of the appointed officer. No new matters have been raised based on the applicant's statement on the notice of review, and the applicants have indicated that in their view no further procedure is required and that the review may proceed on the basis of these written submissions only. It will be for members to determine whether they consider such further procedure as a site visit or a hearing is required, but we'll come back around to that shortly. So just flicking through, first and foremost, we have a location plan here with the application site outlined in red and the applicant's wider ownership outlined by the blue line there. The application site extends to 0.43 hectares and forms part of the existing residential curtilage located on the northern side of Blacktop Road at its junction with Bailey's Wells Road. The donor property at Highview House sits within a plot of approximately 1.1 hectares, which slopes down to the road and is bounded by conifer plantations to the north and to the east. The proposed new house plot is in the southern portion of the Highview House site. Sorry, I'll just slip back to that original slide. Yes, it's in the southern portion of the Highview House site, with both properties to be served by the existing driveway access that you can see coming in from the southeastern corner of the site there. There are a number of shrubs and smaller trees within the site, and its southern boundary to Blacktop Road is defined by a low stone wall and high Leylandii hedging, which is over 3 metres in height. That hedging continues westwards along the road frontage of the neighbouring land and offers screening to the site of the proposed new house from the road. In terms of local development plan zoning, the site itself is zoned as both green space network and forms part of the green belt in the local development plan, and accordingly policies NE1 and NE2 relating to the green space network and the designated green belt will apply. Through here we have an aerial photo and you'll see there the site outlined in red, the wider Highview House site just to the north, and then the conifer plantations that we mentioned just in the surrounding area. This is the site plan as proposed, and we have a zoomed in version that I'll come back to there. You'll notice there are some arrows indicated on this plan where key viewpoints have been identified by the applicant in their submission, and we have some later slides that will show you views from those positions. In terms of planning history, the officer's report of handling noted no planning history of relevance. And in terms of the proposal, first and foremost, I'll just take you through these slides. So, as I mentioned, you have the numbers indicated on the plan here. If we flick through those, you can see that I've indicated with a larger red arrow where each view is taken from, and on the photograph you can see superimposed the outline of the dwelling house, so you can have an indication of what the landscape impact might be. So these first two images, just flicking between those, are on the approach up Bailey's Wells Road. The house itself would actually be concealed behind the conifer hedging for the most part there. This third image is just from the junction of Blacktop Road and Bailey's Wells Road. And again, the house would be obscured by the existing planting, assuming that was to be maintained. Sorry, going the wrong direction there. This fourth view is approaching from the east, looking west along Blacktop Road, and again you can see that the existing conifer planting, provided that was maintained, would offer screening. House. Same applies on approach from the west. and this is the furthest view along that western approach. So here's the site plan as proposed. The proposal seeks detailed planning permission for the erection of a new detached house with double garage and associated access road. You can see the access road in the bottom right corner of the red box there, just branching off from the existing driveway and sharing its access from the road. The 4-bedroom, 2-storey dwelling includes an integrated garage, and at ground floor level the building would be finished in rubble masonry, with the upper floor finished in vertical timber linings and the roof in zinc cladding. If I just flick forward here, I think I should have some elevation images that perhaps show that best. So this is a proposed ground floor plan where you can see the double garage described there. The first floor plan, with the house being sort of built into the landscape, you can see that the first floor plan is actually on a much larger footprint than the ground floor, with covered terrace and balcony area and roof garden enclosed by glass balustrade above the garage. So this is what that looks like in elevation view. As I mentioned, that rubble masonry finish to the ground floor level, and then at the upper floor level, timber linings used, and then a grey metal standing seam cladding for the roof, with glass balustrades around the enclosed sort of garden area on top of the roof. So just flicking through the images, this shows the sort of side views as well. So turning to the reasons for refusal, the appointed officer's reasons for refusal are stated in full on the decision notice within your agenda pack. These make reference to the following factors. Firstly, that the principle of a new dwelling in this location is not supported by the local development plan by way of its Greenbelt policy NE2, which allows for only certain specified types of development in Greenbelt areas. In addition, the proposal was seen to be at odds with Scottish planning policy, which sets out the role of greenbelts in protecting the landscape setting of cities and towns and directing development to appropriate locations. It was also viewed that the site would not be accessible by public transport, and therefore it's likely the occupants of the development would be unduly dependent on use of the private vehicle. On that basis, the proposal was seen to conflict with the policy objectives of policies T2 and T3 relating to the transport impact of development and promotion of sustainable and active travel, as well as the relevant supplementary guidance. That lack of accessibility by sustainable means was also seen to fail to accord with Scottish planning policy's expectations of sustainable development. Lastly, in terms of the reasons for refusal, it's noted that given the possibility of the existing trees along the southern and western boundaries being removed without recourse to the planning authority, it was considered that those couldn't be relied upon as providing guaranteed screening of the site and of the proposed house. And on that basis, should they be removed, there is potential for the development to have an adverse visual impact on the character of the rural landscape and wider greenbelt. On that basis, the appointed officer concluded that the proposal has the potential to conflict with the aims of policy D2 relating to landscape of the local development plan, as well as Scottish planning policy. In terms of the appellant's case, a statement has been submitted in support of the application for local review. Again, that's included within the agenda pack. It refers directly to the reasons for refusal, and the main points put forward are as follows. Firstly, argues that the development does in fact comply with the relevant policies of the local development plan, and states that whilst not specifically listed as an exception under policy NE2, Greenbelt, the proposal would nevertheless not undermine the aims of Greenbelt designations. It's contended that the site is well located relative to the future facilities and services that would be provided as part of the Countess Wells development. And it's highlighted that the lack of landscape impact due to existing tree cover is such that there would be no real impact on landscape, and points out that Aberdeen City Council could serve a tree protection order in order to ensure the long-term retention of trees if, as the reasons for refusal suggest, there's some concern about their long-term retention. Lastly, highlights lack of objection from consultees. In terms of consultees, there was no objection from the Council's waste strategy team, or flooding team, or roads development management team. The local Cults, Beelside and Mill Timber Community Council offered a neutral response, stating that it did not object to the current application, but is nevertheless concerned by the proposal on the basis that, if consented, it may result in further incremental development of the area. The land under the applicant's control, it's pointed out, was also considered for 5 dwelling houses as a development option or development bid for the 2022 Aberdeen Local Development Plan under reference B0925. However, on assessment by officers, that was considered unsuitable for inclusion in the next local development plan. In terms of representations, there was one single representation received. This made points regarding the proposal not being consistent with Greenbelt policy, the proposed splitting of the residential plot having an unacceptable impact on the character and identity of the rural locale, and pointing out that the proposal would not be consistent with policies relating to landscape in the local development plan. And lastly, that it could set a bad precedent for similar development in what is a semi-rural area. On that point, Councillor MacDonald, I would just hand back to you for members to determine whether you consider any further procedure is necessary. So I'll just stop sharing my screen at that point.
Thank you very much, Mr. Evans. We now, members, need to consider whether we have sufficient information in front of us today to take a decision on the application. Members will note that the applicant has stated that the local review body should proceed without any further procedure before determination. So, members, remember that if you do not feel you have enough information to take a decision, you can request further written information, or hearings can be arranged or a site visit be undertaken. First of all, can I come to you, Councillor Duncan, and ask, could you please state if you have sufficient information to take a decision, and if you do not feel any further procedures are required, please state for the minute the reason why.
I have enough information to make a decision, thank you.
Thank you, Councillor MacDonald. Councillor Mackenzie, could I ask you the same? Could you please state if you have sufficient information to take a decision, and if you do not feel any further procedures are required, please state for the minute the reason why.
Yes, I've received sufficient information.
Thank you very much, Councillor Mackenzie. I too have sufficient information to take a decision today, and I feel that I don't need any further information or a site visit. I thank the officers for bringing forward the information for us to view today. So, members, as we feel that we have sufficient information, we will now hear from Mr. Evans on any relevant policies and further considerations for this review, or any questions that might come from the discussion.
Thank you, Convener. Again, I'll just share the agenda pack. Okay, can everybody see that okay?
Yes.
Perfect, thank you.
Thanks.
So, moving on now to the relevant policy considerations. First and foremost, the application site lies in an area which is designated as part of the Green Space Network. This is designated with the intention of protecting, promoting and enhancing wildlife, access, recreation, ecosystems and landscape value of the network of interconnected green spaces. Proposals which would be likely to destroy or erode the character or function of the green space network will not be permitted under policy in E1. So that's really the question that members want to be asking themselves in terms of that policy. Moving on, as we heard, the application sites within the designated green belt, where there are only specified types of development that are provided for by policy NE2. So in short, policy NE2 sets out that no development will be permitted in the Greenbelt for purposes other than those essential for agriculture, woodland and forestry, recreational uses compatible with an agricultural or natural setting, mineral extraction or quarry restoration, or landscape renewal. So clearly the proposal for a new domestic dwelling house doesn't fall within any of those categories. Policy NE2 subsequently follows up with a number of specified exceptions. So those include proposals for development with existing activities in the Greenbelt. So that might be, for example, where there are business premises already located in the Greenbelt. The small scale expansion of those existing facilities may be supported under that part of the policy. Essential infrastructure works, the conversion of buildings of architectural or historic interest. So that might be the likes of steading conversion, where there's a traditional or vernacular building of note, which is worthy of being converted and retained. And on that basis, conversion to a dwelling house is provided for by the policy. And lastly, replacement houses on a one-to-one basis. So in a Greenbelt location, it's possible for an existing house to be demolished and replaced by a single new dwelling house. So there's no net difference in the number of properties there. So the conclusion of that really is that there's no provision for a single new build house on Greenbelt land. NE2 also states that all proposals for development in the Greenbelt must be of the highest quality in terms of siting, scale, design and materials. So members will want to think about whether you consider this to be meeting that requirement. So moving on. Oh, sorry, should have come to that slide before. So moving on to policy D1, quality placemaking by design. This requires development to be of a high standard of design, which demonstrates an understanding of its context. So this is really echoing that design requirement of policy NE2. So the context here is clearly one of a semi-rural location. Policy D1 requires us to have regard to the 6 qualities of essential to good placemaking. Those being that development should be distinctive, should be welcoming, safe and pleasant, easy to move around, adaptable and resource efficient. Moving on from that, we also have adopted supplementary guidance in relation to the subdivision and redevelopment of residential curtilages. What I would say is that this guidance is perhaps geared more towards existing urban areas where there are individual house plots that are of a particular size, which can accommodate an additional dwelling by subdividing the plot. In Greenbelt locations, it's perhaps more appropriate for members to first satisfy themselves about the principle of development before moving on to detailed assessment against this supplementary guidance. Nevertheless, I'll just summarise the sort of main points coming from that. So it highlights the importance of having regard for the established spatial character and built form of the surrounding area, and sets out a number of criteria by which proposals might be assessed. So new dwellings must respect the established pattern of development formed by the relationship between buildings and their surrounding spaces. The scale and massing of any new dwelling should complement the scale of surrounding properties, and the density of the surrounding area should be reflected in the development proposals for both the new and the existing property. As a general guide, no more than 1/3 of the total site area for each individual curtilage should be built upon. Continuing on to the next slide here, new dwellings should generally not project forward of any established building line. Again, as I mentioned, because we're in a sort of semi-rural Greenbelt location here, there is no established building line in Highview House itself being a sort of individual isolated property. The distance between proposed dwellings and between proposed and existing dwellings should be similar to that predominating on a street, and the ridges or wall heads of any new dwelling should be no higher than the ridges or wall heads of adjoining dwellings. So you can see from those points that's perhaps more geared towards the existing built-up area with near neighbours. So just concluding, then with main points to consider. There are other material considerations in addition to the local development plan, those being Scottish planning policy, which highlights the purpose of greenbelt designations to direct planned growth to the most appropriate locations, thereby supporting regeneration of existing urban areas and brownfield sites. Also to protect and enhance the quality, character, landscape setting and identity of towns and cities. The idea being that we shouldn't see coalescence between individual settlements and we should retain the identity of those settlements. Also a material consideration, as mentioned by the local community council, is the previous submission of land at Highview House for inclusion in the proposed local development plan. So this was submitted as a development bid for 5 units. On assessment by officers, it was ultimately concluded that inclusion in the local development plan would be undesirable, on the basis that the site is next to ancient woodland and would have an unfavourable impact on the natural environment. It was also concluded that the site is poorly located for public transport and local services and facilities, and therefore would be car dependent. Ultimately, that it would be somewhat isolated. And lastly, referred to there being a generous housing supply on better sites, and on that basis it wasn't taken forward for inclusion in the proposed plan. So really the questions that members may want to consider: firstly, does the proposal comply with Greenbelt policy as expressed in NE2 and Scottish planning policy? In terms of the green space network, do members consider the proposal would destroy or erode the value of that network? And ultimately, do members consider the proposal complies with the development plan? If not, are there any other material considerations that might weigh in its favour? Or if you consider that the proposal does comply with the plan, then perhaps ask you to express your reasoning for that. At that point, Councillor MacDonald, that's concluded my presentation, so I'll just hand back over to you for members to deliberate.
Thank you very much, Mr. Evans. And now we come to any questions for Mr. Evans. Can I throw that out to yourselves, Councillor Mackenzie and Councillor Duncan, if you could let me know if you have any questions at this point, please.
Yes, I have some questions, please, Convener.
Please go ahead, Councillor Duncan.
Okay. The applicant mentions in their submissions that a tree protection order could be issued to maintain the screening. Is that something that is able to be a condition of the application being consented?
Thank you, Councillor Duncan. I'm not sure that's something that would meet the necessary tests for conditions, because in applying a tree preservation order, the planning authority, the council, would ultimately need to be satisfied that any tree preservation order met the necessary tests for that order, which I can't say I'm intimately familiar with. Those would normally be assessed by the council's arboriculturalist. So there's a sort of separate process to be gone through there, and I don't think it would be within our gift to require that or to sort of prejudge it, if you see what I mean.
Okay, thank you for that. I have one other question, if that's all right, Convener.
Yes, go ahead.
I wondered if we could go back to the map that shows both the Countess Wells development site to the east and this site, please. Is that possible?
Sorry, I didn't realise my microphone was still muted there. Yes, I'll just see if I can get that up.
Yeah, that's fine. The applicant again in their submissions refers to a previous decision by the LRB about a site that was immediately adjacent to a development site. Now, I think I was on that LRB, so I do remember it, and I looked it up last night. But I noticed from this this map that there is actually, it's about 200 meters, they say, isn't it? There's a difference along Blacktop Road between where this site is and where the Countess Wells site is, and it's the forest in between. It's the ancient woodland, the Countess Wells forest in between. Is that right?
I believe so. Yes.
Okay. Okay. So right, that's fine. I just wanted to double check. I think there's an issue here about what we mean by adjacent to a development site. So we can have that in the discussion, I think.
Yes, I think probably one point to take away is that wherever there is a release of land for new housing, there will almost inevitably be an area of greenbelt immediately adjacent to it, and the risk in sort of accepting the argument that a site is just next door is that there will always be a multitude of sites just next door to a land release for housing, and to allow sites on that basis might sort of undermine the overall plan-led approach.
Okay, thank you. I have no further questions. Thank you, convener.
Thank you, Councillor Duncan. Councillor Mackenzie, can I ask if you have any questions to ask Mr. Evans?
No, I have no questions.
Can I ask Mr. Evans on the point made about the new development plan and the application that was made for 5 houses on this site that didn't go into the new local development plan? Is there, can I ask, has the applicant at any time talked about that? I couldn't see anything in the paper that I read, but has there been anything there to say that they would not go ahead and build any further properties on that site to the west?
So what we were referring to there was the development bid that was put in by the applicants as part of the proposed plan process. There's a process called the call for sites, essentially, where developers can come forward and sort of offer their sites as a means of contributing to the identified needs in the plan period. There follows a development bids assessment by officers in the council's local development plan team, and there's a sort of sustainability checklist and scoring checklist which is applied to that ultimately arrives at a scoring for any given site, and then it's essentially something of a beauty contest where all of the sites that are brought forward are sort of compared against one another, and those which are seen as best able to meet the identified housing needs in a way which is consistent with Scottish planning policy and other national policy are then taken forward. So at this point that seems to have been knocked out of the running, and I'm not sure if the applicants would have any intention to come back at sort of subsequent development plan stages.
And do we have any way of putting that in as a condition if we could?
A condition for inclusion of the site in the local development plan, you mean?
Yeah.
No, we wouldn't be able to do that. That's essentially a separate process.
Okay, thank you for that. That was my questions. So we come on now to, in accordance with the procedure notes circulated, the local review body will now discuss and decide the manner in which the review is to proceed. I would highlight that all representations relating to the case have been considered and taken into account. So in that determination, Councillor Duncan, can I come to you first and please ask you to state your decision in respect of the application? And well, let's have a discussion first. I reckon would be probably better, then we can come to that. Is there anything you want to bring for consideration, Councillor Duncan? You're muted, Councillor Duncan.
That better, sorry. To be honest, I'm finding this quite a straightforward one. I don't think there are any material considerations which would overturn the officer's decision. I think it's clearly greenbelt land. It's not immediately adjacent to Countess Wells, and I take Mr. Evans' point that there's always going to be land adjacent to Countess Wells, and therefore that's not really a valid argument for me for allowing development on this site. I have to say, I'm also concerned about the access to the site on that corner, just opposite the junction with Bailey's Wells Road. You have another big house on the same site. You're inevitably going to have more cars going in and out, and I think that's a consideration as well for refusal. And I do worry, given the background to this site, that the applicant had previously intimated a desire to do extensive development on it, with an application for it to be included in the local development plan for 5 properties. I do worry that by granting this application, we would be setting a precedent for further development on that site of a cluster of houses, which would be out of character with the area. So I'm happy to listen to everyone else's views, but at the moment, I am minded to uphold the officer's original decision.
Thank you, Councillor Duncan. Do you want to add anything at the moment, Councillor Mackenzie, to the debate?
No, nothing other than to say I agree entirely with what Councillor Duncan has said.
Okay, coming to me, my view is similar. I believe that under any 2, I would be upholding the officer's decision. I also think under T2 and T3 there are transport issues, and I take on board what Mr. Evans said about Scottish planning policy as well. So can I then get, I will be upholding the officer's decision. I guess that's a unanimous decision. Can I ask how we actually record that? Is that enough, or do we want to go around the table for the clock?
So convener, I can just do like a roll call for the recording, just so we're all in agreement, if that's helpful.
Thank you.
Okay. So Councillor Duncan, can you please state that you're in agreement to refuse the application in line with the officer's recommendation?
Yes, I am.
Thank you. Councillor Mackenzie?
Yes, I am.
Thank you. And Councillor MacDonald?
Agreed.
Okay, so that was a unanimous refusal of the application. Thank you.
Thank you.
Councillor MacDonald, Councillor Bolton is online now, so if you want to hold on a second till we get Councillor Bolton to chair the next 2. Councillor Bolton, are you there?
Here we go. Here I am. Thank you
Hello.
very much, Councillor MacDonald, for chairing that, as it was in my ward. And thank you all very much for your efforts there.
Okay. I'll just hand over to you, Councillor.
Thank you very
Councillor
much.
Bolton, can I just say I can only see the top half of your head at the moment, so you might want to angle your being a little.
Oh, I can see my whole body. Well, my whole head. I mean,
well, maybe somebody else can.
No, all I can see is your eyes.
That's bizarre. Let's see if I can try it this way.
That's better.
Is that better? Okay.
Very much better.
How's that? Is that okay, Councillor Duncan? Can you see me?
Yes, in your full glory, Councillor Bolton.
Okay. I'm not in my pajamas, I promise. Okay, thank you very much, Councillor MacDonald, for chairing the first one. If we move back to the agenda, which is starting back on agenda item 3.1. And just for completing this, can I just confirm everyone has the procedure note as identified at 1.1 on the agenda, given I'm just taking over now? Okay, excellent. Right, so now returning to consideration of the second review in respect of the decision to refuse the application for the erection of a single-storey extension to the public and facing rear and formation of dormers to the front and rear at 36 Raden Crescent, Aberdeen, application at number 191508. We will now hear from the planning advisor, Mr. Gavin Evans, who will provide us with a brief description of the application proposal and a reminder of the reason why the application was refused. I would again point out that Mr. Evans attends today's meeting to provide us with the necessary professional planning guidance because he has not been involved in the earlier consideration of the application under review. Mr Evans will not, however, be asked to express any view on the merits of the proposed development, and in effect his role will be a neutral one involving the provision of factual information and guidance only. Over to yourself, Mr Evans.
Thank you, convener. Just be a second here while I get the agenda up again. Hopefully everyone can see that now. Okay, great. Right, so moving on, item 3.1, this was a request for review against the appointed officer's refusal under delegated powers of this application for the erection of a single-storey extension to the public-facing northeast rear. I'm not sure about the wording there, it seems a little bit, but there's a single-storey extension to the northeast elevation and formation of dormers to the front and rear of the existing property at 36 Reading Crescent. If anyone's following separately via the agenda, the accompanying PowerPoint slides presentation begins at page 89 of the agenda pack. So again, this review was found to have been submitted with all the necessary information and within the time limit of 3 months following the appointed officer's decision. The applicants indicated on the notice of review that no new matters have been raised, i.e. things that weren't before the appointed officer at the time of their decision. And in terms of procedure by which the review will be conducted, the applicant has expressed satisfaction that the review may proceed to conclusion without further procedure based on these written submissions. So just turning to a description of the site, slides on pages 90 and 91 just show the location. So the property is a 2-storey semi-detached house, outlined in red here just on the plan, located within a mid-20th century residential development on the southern side of Westburn Road. The dry dash rendered property can be seen through trees from Westburn Road, and I have a couple of slides that give a bit of context just by way of sort of street view images. That's a zoomed in version of the location plan again. This is Westburn Road, just running across the site. So this is the approach up Westburn Road, and I've just shown the application property sort of shaded in red there for a bit of context. So you can see that there's a sort of landscape strip at the edge of the road and some tree planting in the intervening land, which offers a degree of screening, but nevertheless the property can be seen quite prominently on that approach. This is just from the road sitting level with the house. You can see the roof, and this elevation is the one to be extended, the rear elevation. The front elevation essentially faces into a sort of enclosed courtyard space that's formed on 3 sides by other properties. Again, this is a sort of enclosed court space, and this is a photo taken from the sort of car park, public road area. So again, you can see the property there, and the dormer windows would be obviously in the roof space there. So, sorry, I went a little bit off script there. The southwest elevation fronts onto an area of open space, which is shared with other properties. That's this area in here that you can see. And due to a change in the ground levels, the property sits on a bit of a slope, with the rear elevation sitting approximately 0.8 of a metre lower. You can just about see that in the base course here of this property as it slopes down relative to the ground level. It's notable that in the surrounding development, it's characterised by rows of properties arranged around public open spaces and footpaths with separate communal car parks. However, dormer windows are not a prevalent feature of the original properties, and there are no apparent examples in the immediately surrounding area. So this is just an image taken from the applicant's submission, which I think is a Google Street View. You can see the mark there, but gives you an indication that there aren't really any dormers to be seen on the surrounding roofs. In terms of the local development plan, the site is zoned as a residential area, whereby policy H1 of the plan will apply. We'll come back to what policy H1 says just shortly. The appointed officer's report indicated no planning history of relevance for this site. And turning to the proposal itself, detailed planning permission sought for the erection of box dormers on the front and rear slopes of the roof, as well as the erection of a single-storey extension to the rear. Now this slide shows the sort of existing and proposed block plan, so existing on the left, proposed on the right, with the extension shown in yellow. So relatively modest footprint for the extension. Flicking forward now, that's the sort of zoomed in version, so you can see the extent to which the ground floor accommodations extended there. And the first floor plan, obviously no change in the first floor plan. You just see the roof of the extension because it's just on a single story. At proposed second floor level, this shows the accommodation that would be formed through the introduction of the dormer windows on the front and rear slope of the roof. So providing for bedroom 3 and bedroom 4 as shown there. And that's just the roof plan that shows the sort of flat roof in yellow of the proposed dormer windows. So turning to the elevations, this is the sort of rear elevation that faces towards Westburn Road that we saw. So you can see the general scale and form of the extension there with the sort of lean-to style roof, concrete roof tiles to match the existing property, clad in brick, which the existing properties are rendered, so it's not an exact match. However, I think the appellants would contend that it's a complementary finish, given the sort of brick coursing to the wall that's shown here. Sorry, excuse me, I've just gone off script again. So yeah, the extension finished with brick walls, concrete roof tiles and white UPVC framed windows and doors. In terms of the dormer windows, those are approximately 5.5 metres in width, positioned 0.6 metres below the roof ridge, so that's just the distance here that we're referring to there. Located on the mutual boundary with the adjoining semi, and approximately 680 millimetres in from the edge of the roof on this site. So the front face would be fully glazed with dark grey window frames, and the sides and roof would be finished in a grey metal cladding. Just turning then, so sorry, that's the rear elevation with the extension. That's the front elevation facing onto the sort of enclosed public open space. This is the side view, just gives you an indication of how those dormers would look in the context of the roof slope. And as we saw, that's a view which is perhaps going to be seen from Westburn Road. Sections just showing the head height and the sort of the space through. It's more of a technical detail. So turning to the appointed officer's reasons for refusal, these make reference to the following factors. Firstly, the dormers are seen to detract from the uniform character and established pattern of development in the surrounding area. The design and scale are seen to dominate the roof of the property, and it's argued that they're not designed to match the style of the original house. Given the absence of existing dormers in the surrounding area, the officer concluded that approval would risk setting a precedent for similar proposals, which would detract from the uniform character and visual amenity of the surrounding area. As a result, it was seen that there would be a conflict with policies D1 relating to design quality and H1 relating to residential areas of the local development plan, as well as the associated supplementary guidance contained in the Householder Development Guide. No material considerations to warrant departing from the local development plan were identified by the officer. In terms of the appellant's case, this is included in a statement which is at page 150 to 159 of the agenda pack. The sort of central points being made are it notes that the reasons for refusal relate to the dormer windows only and not to the extension. So just really highlighting there that the appointed officer didn't express any particular concern about the ground floor extension. Argues that the introduction of dormer windows would not harm the amenity or appearance of the area. Contends that the distance from Westburn Road and the intervening tree cover offer partial screening, so that mitigates the visual impact. Considers that the dormers would not dominate the roof, as stated by the officer in his report, and highlights that some representations were not from local addresses. members may be aware, but the ability to object to a planning application or make representation on a planning application isn't dependent on where you live. You know, you can comment from anywhere. So just a point to make there. In terms of consultations, the Council's Roads Development Management team expressed no objection following submission of photographic evidence that showed that there are commonly spaces in the existing car park, so it's not operating at or beyond its capacity. The local Rosemountain Mell End Community Council didn't provide a response for this application. There were 4 letters of representation received. Those are included in full in the agenda pack, but the main points really related to concern about the scale of the extension and its impact on the adjoining property at number 34, the design and scale of the dormers being too large, the visual impact of dormers in this location, the materials not being an appropriate match for the dwelling, a potential loss of privacy for neighbours, and concern about precedent for similar proposals. In terms of loss of privacy, I would just point out that the officer's report didn't express any particular concerns in this regard. So at that point, convener, I would just hand back to you to have members decide if any further procedures necessary in this case. So I'll just turn off the screen sharing.
Thank you very much, Mr. Evans. We will now need to consider whether we have sufficient information in front of us today to take a decision on the application. Members will note that the applicant has stated that no further procedures are necessary before determination. Members, remember that if you do not feel you have enough information to take a decision, you can request a site visit to be undertaken, that further written information be provided, or that a hearing is arranged. If I could ask Councillor Duncan if you could please state if you have sufficient information to take a decision, or if you feel you would require a further procedure, and please state the reasons for the minute.
I have enough information to make a decision. Thank you, convener.
Thank you, Councillor Duncan. Councillor Mackenzie, could you also please state if you have sufficient information to take a decision, or if you feel a further procedure is required, please state that for the minute the reason.
Yes, I have enough information to make a decision.
Okay. I equally have more than enough information from both Mr. Evans and also knowledge of the local area, so I'm comfortable that we're in a position to make a determination today, so thank you. As members feel that we have sufficient information, we will now hear from Mr. Evans on the relevant policies and consideration for the review.
Thank you, convener. I'll just share the agenda pack again here. And remember to turn on the camera. Right, so is that sharing okay for everyone?
Yes, thank you.
Great. Right then, turning to the relevant policy considerations next. As I mentioned, the site's located in an area zoned as a residential area in the local development plan, wherein policy H1 will apply. This sets out a number of criteria by which proposals should be assessed. So these include proposals for new development will be acceptable in principle if they do not constitute overdevelopment of a given plot, do not have an unacceptable impact on the character and amenity of the surrounding area. So for that second point, there's a matter of judgment for members on what you consider the character and amenity of the area to be at present and how this development in particular would affect that. Thirdly, proposals should not result in a loss of valuable or valued areas of open space. In this case, we're talking about a residential plot, so it would only affect the applicant's own garden, so there's no effect there. And lastly, proposals should comply with supplementary guidance. In this case, the relevant supplementary guidance is the Householder Development Guide, so I'll come to that just next. The Householder Development Guide sets out a series of general principles, first and foremost. These state as follows. Proposals should be architecturally compatible in design and scale with the original house and the surrounding area. Extensions should not dominate or overwhelm an original house, and extensions should remain visually subservient. No extension should result in a situation where the amenity of neighbouring properties would be adversely affected, for example, in terms of privacy, daylight and general amenity. And earlier developments approved before this guidance was introduced will not be accepted as justification in support of proposals which otherwise fail to adhere to these criteria. The footprint of a dwelling as extended should not exceed twice that of the original house. As we saw, in this case, the extension was quite a modest footprint, so no concern in that regard. Sorry, last point, no more than 50% of the front or rear curtilage may be covered by development. There's also specific guidance in relation to single-storey extensions to semi-detached dwellings, stating that these should be limited to 4 metres along a mutual boundary, and if positioned off the boundary, will be considered on a case-by-case basis. Again, the modest projection of this along the boundary was not seen as being a concern for the appointed officer. So that's general principles. Next, there's specific content on dormer windows. First, a couple of general principles. New dormers should respect the scale of a building and shouldn't dominate, overwhelm or unbalance the original roof. In terraces or blocks of properties of uniform design, where there are no existing dormers, the construction of new dormers will not be supported on the front or other prominent elevations, for example, where fronting onto a road. So what we saw here is that the rear elevation has a degree of prominence and fronts onto the road despite being notionally the back of the house. And then there's more detailed specifications in relation to dormer windows on modern properties. So firstly, new dormers, sorry, that's reiterating one that was in the general principles, so I'll just leave that. Secondly, they should not be built directly off the wallhead, and aprons should be avoided on principal elevations. Aprons is essentially solid bits underneath the window on a dormer window. So this proposal didn't include any aprons and wasn't built off directly off the wallhead. It should be positioned a minimum of 600 millimetres below the existing roof ridge. We saw from the applicant's drawings that 600 millimetres is maintained, and should be positioned a minimum 600 millimetres in from the gable or party wall. The dormer windows proposed here are 680 millimetres in from the gable wall, although they are positioned on the party wall shared with the adjoining neighbour. However, there is provision for that in certain cases in the guidance. Glazing should be included to the extremities, and there should be more glazing than solid. We saw from the elevations that this is a wholly glazed dormer window. You know, the frontage of it is all glass. And finishes should match those of the original building. There's perhaps a matter of judgment there in terms of whether you consider the grey metal cladding to be used is an appropriate match or is appropriately complementary to the existing finishes. And lastly, wherever possible, the window proportion and arrangement should echo those on the floors below. So what we're really talking about there is carrying on the position of windows up through the building, so there's a degree of sympathy in terms of the design. So turning next to policy D1, this is universal policy applicable to all developments. Requires development to be of a high standard of design which demonstrates an understanding of its context. So again, context is crucial here, and it's how members consider that context to be sensitive or not to this development. Just summing up then, points for consideration. Firstly, whether members consider the proposal complies with the tests set out in policy H1, whether you consider the design quality meets the requirements of policy D1, and whether the proposal adheres to the principles set out for both extensions and dormer windows in the Householder Development Guide. Ultimately coming to a conclusion on whether you feel the proposal complies with the development plan when considered as a whole, and then following on from that, if there are any material considerations out with the development plan that sway your view one way or the other. I'm happy to assist with reasons for your decision or conditions as necessary. Thank you, Convener.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Evans, once again. In accordance with first of all, we'll take questions for Mr. Evans. Councillor Duncan, do you have any questions?
Unusually for me, no, I don't. Thank you. That was very clear.
Thank you, Councillor Duncan. Councillor Mackenzie, do you have any questions?
No, I don't have any questions.
And I think you're going to get off quite lightly, Mr. Evans, because I actually, again, I don't have any questions because, again, I think the information you provided and the photographs are very telling and straightforward. So if there's no further questions, in accordance with the procedure note circulated, the local review body will now discuss and decide the manner in which to review to proceed. I would highlight that all representations relating to the case have been considered and taken into account. Councillor Duncan, please, if you could maybe give us your position.
Okay. This is a really difficult one because it's important that houses are usable for families, and I mean houses that were built 50 odd years ago are much smaller and more difficult for modern families to live in. So I understand why the householder is keen to extend his house and stay in this area. And I note that the original decision maker didn't have a problem with the rear extension, and I don't have any issues with that. The problem for me, as was the original decision maker's problem, is the dormer and the size and dominance of it. And I think it is relevant, and you referred to the photographs in your comments a minute ago. I think it is very relevant that this is a very prominent site that can be seen from Westburn Road, and I just think that the scale and mass of these dormers in that roof is too much, and they would visually dominate. And I also note that there are no other dormers in this scheme, which is of a pretty uniform development. And this, I'm worried that this would set a precedent for this size and scale of dormer to be added to other houses in the schemes. The dormer also doesn't match the window styles as policy D1 requires. So it's with real regret, actually, that I feel that I have to uphold the original decision maker's reasoning and rationale for their decision.
Thank you, Councillor Duncan. Councillor Mackenzie.
I agree with everything that Councillor Duncan has said, especially the dormers, they're totally dominating the whole of the building.
So are you concluding that you would uphold the officer's recommendation?
I uphold the officer's decisions.
Okay, thank you, Councillor Mackenzie. You know, I find myself obviously torn as well because, as Councillor Duncan said, what we want to do is make sure that houses are livable for today's families. However, given that there's no dormers already existing in this immediate neighbourhood, I think if there's to become such a case that we see extensions to these houses in terms of dormer windows, I think that the first dormer window has to set the standard, and I think that this one does overwhelm the roof space. And we've heard from Mr. Evans about the windows aligning and creating a certain symmetry for the building. And for me, it's clear that this proposed dormers don't do that. Like the officer who's determined this, I don't have an issue with the rear extension. I can see the value of it, and I think as long as appropriate materials are conditioned, I think it could give additional space to any growing family. However, on the basis of the style and scale of the dormers, I would absolutely uphold the officer's recommendation in refusing this application. So if I could ask Ms. McBain, if you could do a roll call, I think you'll find there's a unanimous decision to uphold the officer's recommendation, but just for completeness, if you could do that, Ms. McBain.
Thank you, convener. So just for the recording, I'll just do a roll call as Councillor Bolton has stated. So Councillor Bolton, are you content to go with the officer's recommendation for refusal?
Yes.
Councillor Duncan?
Yes, I am.
Okay, and Councillor Mackenzie?
Yes, I am.
Thank you. So the application will be refused in line with the original officer's recommendation. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Right, moving on to 4.1 of the agenda. So we'll consider the third review in respect of a decision to refuse the application for the erection of a replacement of a 1.5-storey extension to the rear and straightening of the eaves at 16 Newlands Crescent, Aberdeen, application 191551. We will again hear from planning advisor Mr. Gavin Evans, who will provide us with a brief description of the application proposal and a reminder of the reasons why the application was refused. I would again point out that Mr. Evans attends today's meeting to provide us with the necessary professional planning guidance because he has not been involved in an earlier consideration of the application under review. Mr. Evans will not, however, be asked to express any view on the merits of the proposed development, and in fact his role will be a neutral one involving the provision of factual information and guidance only. So again, over to you, Mr. Evans.
Thank you, Convener. Right, yes, so as you mentioned, this request for review is against a refusal under delegated powers of the erection of a replacement 1.5 storey extension to the rear and straightening of eaves at 16 Newlands Crescent, Aberdeen. The PowerPoint slides for this are at pages 161 to 177 of the agenda, if anyone is other documents thereafter. Again, the review was found to have been submitted with all the necessary information and within the time limit of 3 months following the appointed officer's decision. The applicant has indicated on the notice of review form that no new matters have been raised in the review submissions, and in terms of the procedure by which a review will be conducted, the applicant in this case has indicated that they consider a site visit to be necessary to allow members to see the other properties in the area which have been modified in a similar way to that which is proposed here. I've got some photographs which I can perhaps come back to later, which members could review before they determine whether they consider a site visit to be necessary, just given the current situation.
That'd be helpful. Thank you, Mr. Evans.
So in terms of the site location, this is a residential plot of a traditional 1.5 storey semi-detached dwelling house on the northeast side of Newlands Crescent, indicated in red on this plan here. The property and its adjoining neighbour are of a hipped roof style, incorporating a bay window at ground floor and dormer window within the roof space. Forward, that's an aerial view, which unfortunately seems to obscure the application property itself. And that view is perhaps most useful, really, give you an indication of what we're talking about. The walls of the property are formed in natural granite with a hipped slated roof above. There is an existing single-storey extension to the rear, which abuts the boundary with the adjoining number 14, which is just to the right-hand side of that image, along with a conservatory. The appointed officer's report contends that the surrounding properties are of a similar style and that very few have been significantly altered. However, that view is disputed by the applicants in their supporting documentation, citing a number of examples where properties have been altered in this sort of fashion. The site, in terms of a local development plan, is identified as part of an H1 residential area, so policy H1 will apply as with the previous case. In terms of planning history, the officer's report highlighted no planning history of relevance for this particular site. Turning to the proposal, pages 165 to 171 show as existing and as proposed images. Starting with the site plan, so what we can see in the left-hand image here is the sort of more traditional hipped roof extension which sits along the boundary with the adjoining property, and then the conservatory with the sort of lined roof that you can just see filling in that space. So those would be replaced, and the new extension would roughly match the projection of an extension to the adjoining property. And then we also have the modification to the roof, whereby if you can see here the line of that existing hip to the roof, what we would have now is that being a partial hip. So you can see that best in maybe the elevations there, which follow. So as existing on the left and as proposed on the right. So essentially building up the roof to enclose that space and provide additional accommodation at the upper level. So yes, the proposal is for the alteration of the existing roof to partially straighten the gable, not entirely straighten it, and also add a 1.5 story extension to the rear, which projects 4 metres from the rear wall of the original house and extends to the full width of the property. So that's the rear view there, which you can see. So there's an element of flat roof just along the boundary, and then we have a pitched roof form for the remainder of the rear extension, with the roof tying in with that of the original property. Materials for the extension include rendered walls and roof tiles. Just flicking through more images, this is showing the side view, so that perhaps illustrates the change in the roof. So this is as existing on the top image, with the tiled roof sloping away from us, and then in this bottom image you can see that rendered wall built up, and then there's a sort of half hip retained just at the top of the roof slope there. This shows the height and scale of the rear extension, which, as I mentioned, just broadly matches the projection of an extension to the adjoining property. This is from the other side, so the outline in blue is obviously we're looking through the adjoining property, so this is just giving you a sense of it from number 14. So in terms of the floor plans, gives an indication of what that would provide in terms of space. So kitchen, dining space at ground floor level. The overall footprint not massively different from as existing, just a reconfiguration within an extended envelope. And then at the upper floor level, that's where there's really a gain in terms of the accommodation, with a new ensuite formed and a new bedroom. So turning to the appointed officer's stated reasons for refusal, these make reference to the straightening of the gable imbalancing the pair of dwellings with an adverse impact on the character of the area, a resulting conflict with local development plan policies H1 and D1 relating to design quality and residential areas respectively, as well as the relevant householder development guide supplementary guidance, which specifically prohibits the practice of altering hipped roofs in this manner unless the adjoining property has already been so altered. Concludes that there are no material considerations in this case that would persuade officers that a departure from the development plan would be warranted. In terms of the appellant's case, again, this is set out in a notice of review and accompanying statement. That statement's included in today's agenda packet, pages 205 to 222. The following main points are made in that statement, just to summarise. It draws attention to the lack of objection from neighbours and consultees, highlights that the decision notice and reasons for refusal refer only to the roof alterations and not to the rear extension, so making that distinction that elements of the proposal were considered to be acceptable by the appointed officer. Highlights that the proposed roof would not terminate in a raised gable, but rather a half-hipped roof. So we've gone over the difference between those two, and that is correct as a statement. Contends that half-hipped roofs of the type which is proposed are common on Newlands Crescent, and that 2 notable examples were in fact approved following assessment against the same requirements, same policy requirements that is, albeit not the current development plan. So it was against a previous iteration of the development plan. Those approvals I think date from 2012 and 2013. Submits also that the proposed development would not have an adverse impact on the character and amenity of the area, will allow the applicants to make more efficient use of their home, and complies with the relevant policy and supplementary guidance. On that basis, it should be approved in line with earlier approvals which are seen on Newlands Crescent. In terms of consultations, the Council's Roads Development Management team had no objection to the proposal, and the local Ashley and Broomhill Community Council provided no response. There were no representations either objecting or expressing support. At that point, convener, I would just hand back to you.
Okay, thank you very much again, Mr. Evans. We now need to consider whether we have sufficient information in front of us today to take a decision on the application. Members will note that the applicant, has indicated a site visit should take place before determination. Now, before I ask each member, I did hear from Mr. Evans saying that that he has some additional photographs. Can I just ask Mr. Evans, is that of the streetscape or of any of the pictures that were or houses that had the alteration?
Yes, sorry. I have some pictures of the streetscape taken from Google Street View, but it does sort of highlight a couple of examples where consent's been given previously. So would you like me to flick through?
Yeah, please. I think it'll be helpful for the members just before we ask the question.
Sure. I'll just have to cancel this and then share a different document.
Perfect. Thank you.
Right, so these images taken from Google Street View were dated March 2019, so just bear that in mind that there may be some degree of change in the sort of year or so. So first and foremost, this is just at the junction at the beginning of Newlands Crescent, so looking up the street really. Next image shows number 5 on the left hand side, which is one of the examples cited in the applicant's supporting statement. So that shows, as we're talking, a sort of, sorry, zoom in on this a little bit more, shows that sort of half-hipped approach where the property's been extended, but there's a sort of notional nod to what the roof form was before. Continuing on, number 10 on the right hand side, a similar approach taken. So it just gives you an indication of how those examples sit in the street scene. The application property here, the left-hand semi of these two, the brown windows there. And that's just continuing along the street in the same direction. So a number of unaltered properties before you get to number 23, which is this one here. Just sort of shows you that head-on what the effect of that change is. And next, number 28, that's another example. Again, this has been straightened up, and then there's the partial hip on there. And then this just shows the view continuing up to the curve in the road. I didn't go around because that's perhaps, you get into slightly further away. Just in terms of the dates of those approvals, I just did a quick look back. The one at number 2 was dated from 1998. And number 5 was 2013. Number 10 was 2012. So those are the two most recent, 2012 and 2013. Obviously, the local development plan was adopted 2017. I think the appellant is perhaps making the point that as much as this is those decisions were taken prior to the adoption of the local development plan as it stands, the policy test in supplementary guidance was largely identical in the previous iteration of the plan. So I think that's the point that they're making there. And so I'll just cancel sharing that.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks, Gavin. Councillor Duncan, could you please state if you have sufficient information to take a decision, and if you do not feel that you do not feel any further procedure is required?
Yes, having seen the photographs, yes, I'm fine with the level of information we have. Thanks.
Thanks, Councillor Duncan. Councillor Mackenzie, could you also state if you feel you have sufficient information to take a decision, or if you feel any further procedure is required?
Yes, I'm happy with the information that's been supplied. I don't require any more.
Okay. Equally, I think the photographs provided by Mr. Gavin, sorry, Gavin, I keep calling you that, Mr. Evans, has given us the understanding of the streetscape and the other houses that have been identified by the applicant to support their case. So I think I'm more than happy to proceed today to make a determination. We'll now hear from Mr. Evans on the relevant policies and considerations for this review. Mr. Evans.
Thank you, convener. Sorry, I keep forgetting my microphone's turned off. Just sharing the agenda pack again there. So yes, moving on next to policy considerations. As with the previous case, this is a site which is located in a residential area where policy H1 of the local development plan applies and sets out a few criteria for development to be assessed against. First and foremost, does the proposal constitute overdevelopment of the plot? Secondly, would there be an unacceptable impact on the character and amenity of the surrounding area? And this is something that was referred to by the appointed officer in his decision. So it's perhaps sort of central to the H1 assessment for members to consider what you think the character and amenity of the area is and what level of impact this proposal would have on that and whether it is an unacceptable impact. Thirdly, would the proposal result in the loss of open space? Again, as with the previous case, this is a residential few, so no loss of public open space. And lastly, does proposal comply with the relevant supplementary guidance? And that's another key factor here. So that will be the householder development guide, and I'll just come back to that in a moment. Again, policy D1 relating to design quality is relevant. Requires development to be of a high standard of design, demonstrating an understanding of its context. So really just reiterating again that context is central to the assessment. In terms of the householder development guide, sets out some general principles, as we heard before. Apologies for repetition. Proposals should be architecturally compatible in design and scale with the original house and the surrounding area. Extensions should not dominate or overwhelm the original house. Extensions should remain visually superior.
Apologies, that's my phone just ignore it.
It's okay. No extension should result in a situation where the amenity of neighbouring properties would be adversely affected in terms of privacy, daylight, or amenity. And earlier developments approved before this guidance was introduced will not be accepted as justification in support of proposals that otherwise fail to comply with these criteria. So on that point, as I mentioned before, the appellants are perhaps making the case that yes, it's a different development plan, but in many ways the supplementary guidance and its stipulations are unchanged from when previous cases were approved. The footprint of a dwelling as extended should not exceed twice that of the original house. That doesn't occur in this case. And no more than 50% of the front or rear curtilage may be covered by development. Again, that's not, that guideline isn't breached in this case. Specific content in relation to modifying hipped roof properties from the supplementary guidance. It states that modifying only one half of a hipped roof is likely to result in the roof having an unbalanced appearance. Extending a hipped roof on one half of a pair of semis to terminate at a raised gable will not be accepted unless the following criteria are met. Now, again, this example talks about a raised gable. That's not quite what we're talking about because the sort of half hip is maintained, but arguably it would still have a similar effect in terms of slightly unbalancing the roof. And perhaps to a lesser extent, that's really for members to determine. So those criteria to be assessed won't be accepted unless the other half of the semi has already been altered in this way. So that would cover scenarios where you've already got a property that's been altered like this, so the pair is unbalanced and asymmetrical, and by straightening the other side, you're reintroducing that symmetry and sort of rebalancing the pair. Or the proposal would not, as a result of the existing streetscape and character of buildings, result in any adverse impact on the character or visual amenity of the area. Really what that's getting at is have alterations of this sort been so commonplace that they are now reflective of the character of the area? You know, they're not the exception, they are just part of the accepted fabric. And in that case, the implication is the impact would be much less. Specific guidance on extensions to semi-detached dwellings, which I haven't included in the slide, I'm afraid, states that single-storey extensions would be limited to 4 metres in projection along a mutual boundary. If positioned off the boundary, then assessed on a case-by-case basis. We saw before that the rear extension does project 4 metres along a boundary. It is accommodation across 2 floors, albeit, you know, a full ground floor and then within the roof space above. However, the extension to the adjoining property is such that, you know, the full impact of that increased height is not resulting in any adverse impact, and I think that's the conclusion that the appointed officers reached in their report. So just sort of summing up and looking at the relevant considerations, members should have regard to the development plan and its policies. So first and foremost, do you consider that the proposal complies with the tests set out in policy H1 for residential areas? Do you consider that the proposal is of an appropriate design quality, having regard to factors such as scale, siting, footprint and proportions and materials? Ultimately, coming to a conclusion on whether you consider this proposal complies with the development plan, and then whether there are any other factors out with the development plan which weigh either in favour of approval or refusal. Thank you, Convener. I'll just hand back to you at that point.
Thank you, Mr. Evans. Questions for Mr. Evans? If I could go to Councillor Duncan first.
Thank you, Convener. Can we just get confirmation of how many houses in Newlands Crescent? Do we know how many have been altered to have this half-hipped roof style? Is it 4?
I can't say I've done a full audit of the entire street, but I think what I could do is just scroll through to the applicant's supporting statement, because they've included photos that indicate at least, is that 6?
6, right. Okay.
And that's going up to number 60. So I'm not sure if that's the entirety of the street, but I would suggest it probably is.
Yeah. Okay. No, that's helpful. Thank you. Thank you. I have no further questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Councillor Duncan. Councillor Mackenzie, have you any questions?
No, no questions at all.
Okay. On this occasion, neither do I have any questions. Again, I think the presentation from Mr. Evans was full, and the information included in the pack actually gave plenty information for me to digest and consider. So in accordance with the procedure note circulated, the local review body will now discuss and decide in the manner in which the review is to proceed. I would highlight that all representations relating to the case have been considered and taken into account. I keep going back to you, poor Councillor Duncan, but would you like to state your decision on how you would like to determine this application?
Thank you, Convener. Again, I think my preamble is the same as the previous application, which is it's important that these houses are usable for modern families and to increase the space. I think it's very material that at least 6 houses in this street have been altered to include a very similar type of extension, and I note that all of them have altered half of the hipped roof. So actually, I think the character and amenity of the area has been amended by that. And I note what Mr. Evans has said, that the guidance under the previous local development plan was in effect the same as the guidance we now have. So those applications were granted under the local development plan, and I think it would be consistent for us to interpret the guidance in the same way this time. So I have no issue with the overall design or the materials proposed. It complies with the rules, and I would be minded to grant this application actually on the basis that it would now fit in with the now character and amenity of the street.
Okay, thank you, Councillor Duncan. And again, what we can probably, depending on the outcome of all of our determinations, is we can always put on some additional condition, which will mean that they've got to provide sample materials to officers for approval, and that's quite standard. But again, I'll ask Mr. Evans, should we determine to approve it, to come in at the end. Councillor Mackenzie.
As per usual, I agree with Councillor Duncan. If it had been the first house in the street, I would have upheld the planner's decisions, but because there are others, I feel that we should be allowed to go ahead with the development.
Thank you, Councillor Mackenzie. I'm comfortable actually to make that a unanimous decision. I think that the test was set out looking at the supplementary guidance, which hasn't really altered throughout the developments along the street. I think what we've seen is the almost secondary roof style appearing on the crescent. And I think that this one complies with that secondary style of roof alignment, and I think that should be our test, and I'm comfortable that that's met. We haven't heard any concerns by the officer determining the application over the rear extension, so I'm content to approve that. I think, as Councillor Duncan already mentioned, we've obviously been doing these too many times together, Councillor Duncan. I think we're of the same mind that houses have to be made for modern day living, and I think particularly granite houses, where it's our heritage and we want to see them retained. I think if we can move forward and make them suitable for family living today, it's really important that we do that rather than see these types of houses disappear. I think the important thing as well to say that, you know, I know we've got guidance which says we shouldn't unbalance a roof by allowing one side, but one side has to start somewhere. And we've seen that along the street already. So I think the kind of, if you look at the impact on the sort of the streetscape, I think what we'll start to see is a modification to the roof styles by other people. But I think it's important that it's reflective of either what's originally been developed or of the style that seems to have subsequently followed. And I think that the applicant here has made all efforts to comply with that. So, you know, I think we have got, you know, we do comply with H1, and I believe D1 has, because of the attempt to marry in with other designs on the street, I think quality of place has been provided for as well, and that the supplementary guidance, whilst it is a different local development plan, has virtually remained the same, and because it was appropriate to do it in 2012 and 2013, and it is of the same roof style of adaptation, I think that we're quite within our rights to determine that that test has been met. So Mr. Evans, I think you'll, if you can give some consideration to conditions, I'll just ask Ms. McBain to do a roll call just to confirm for the record.
Okay, thank you, convener. So again, if we could just note for the recording. So I think everyone is unanimously agreed to approve the application as it complies with policy H1 and D1 and also fits in with the character and amenity of the area. So can you just please state for the recording that you're happy to approve the application? Councillor Duncan?
Yes, I'm happy to approve it.
Councillor Mackenzie?
Yes, I approve the application.
Thank you. And convener?
I'm happy to. Could I maybe just before we finalise all of this bit, just ask Mr. Evans if there's any conditions that he feels that we should be attaching?
Okay.
Yes, thank you, convener. I think you mentioned there that it might be appropriate to secure details of materials prior to work starting on site. That would seem the only obvious suggestion to make. So nothing else I would add.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Evans. So with that, we're all agreed and that we overturn the officer's recommendation and move for approval subject to the condition of materials being provided to officers. Okay, Ms. McBain, is that as concluded now?
Thank you very much, convener. Yes, that's the business concluded for today. I'll just read out the bit for the recording. So I can confirm that the meeting has now concluded and that the recording will be stopped and published on the council's website. Thank you for your interest today.
Thanks very much, and thank you, Councillor Duncan, Councillor Mackenzie, Ms. McBain and Mr. Evans for your attendance today, and as always your professionalism. Thanks very much, folks.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye now.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye. Bye.